What's up, guys? Welcome back to another fantasy video where today we have the Stardom Situm for quarterbacks week 7. Now, first up, we have the Thursday night football matchup between the Saints and the Jaguars. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start it with Derek Carr is going to be started this week. Controversial to some, I'm sure. The Jaguars allow the 10th most points per game to quarterbacks with just under 18. He's coming off of 2 consecutive 15-point weeks, and he's struggling to put up consistent numbers. But the Jaguars also allow the second most pass yards in the NFL. I think it's a really good matchup. He has had a lot of tough matchups this season, and there are a lot of tough matchups for quarterbacks this week. So I think I'm going to lean the start here in a more favorable matchup for quarterbacks. As for Trevor Lawrence, the Saints allow the 6th least points per game to quarterbacks with just under 13. He's currently dealing with a knee injury, and he's on a short week. The Saints have forced more interceptions than they have allowed touchdowns, 8 interceptions to 7 touchdowns, and it's just not a great matchup for him overall, and he could be a game-time decision. It's not a good matchup. Trevor Lawrence should be set. Next up, we have an interesting matchup, a really tough matchup between the Ravens and the Lions. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start both of these quarterbacks. Now, for Lamar, the Lions allow the 15th least points per game to quarterbacks with 15.31, but he is the number 7 fantasy quarterback. He has 4 top 10 finishes in 6 weeks, and his rushing yards and rushing touchdowns save his fantasy season because he's been struggling with passing the ball. So he's definitely going to be a start. As for Jared Goff, the Ravens do allow the 2nd least points per game to quarterbacks with under 10, but he is currently the number 5 fantasy quarterback. He has 4 games of 19 or more points, and 5 out of his 6 games have been against defenses ranked 16th or better versus the quarterback. He is putting up consistent numbers regardless of which defense he faces, and he should be started because of that consistency. The Bears versus the Raiders are up next, and normally I would start players like Jimmy G, but we're going to avoid everybody involved in this game for quarterbacks. Jimmy G, he's dealing with an injury. If he can't go, there's no telling who's going to be starting between Brian Hoyer or Aiden O'Connell. So I would love to start Jimmy G, but because it's uncertain that he's going to play, it's just better to avoid the entire quarterback room. As for Tyson Bagent, the rookie, he took over for Fields in quarter 3 last game, and he had 2 turnovers in those 2 quarters, including a fumble recovery for a touchdown. He needs to be implemented in the offense and get used to the game at the NFL level before we should even consider starting him. Even Fields has been struggling in this offense to produce consistently, so it's just better to avoid him. Next up, we have the Colts versus the Browns. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Deshaun Watson if he's playing. The Colts allow the 8th most points per game to quarterbacks with just under 18. He has 2 20-point performances in the 3 weeks that he's played, and the offense just clicks more when he's at quarterback. If Watson doesn't play, however, you definitely need to sit whatever Browns quarterback goes in. As for Gardner Minshew, the Browns allow the 4th least points per game to quarterbacks with 10.8. They're coming off of a huge upset victory over who many consider the Super Bowl favorite 49ers, and I can't see this defense for the Browns slowing down. I feel like they're just going to eat Minshew up. He's coming off of a 4-turnover game, and they just have the best scoring/pass defense in the entire NFL. It's best to just avoid whatever quarterback is playing against them. Next up, we have an AFC divisional matchup between the Patriots and the Bills. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Josh Allen. It's same week after week. Yeah, the Patriots do allow the 5th least points per game to quarterback. However, Josh Allen is the number 1 fantasy quarterback. He is dealing with some shoulder soreness, but he's locked in at QB1, and I'm sure he still will be for the rest of the season. Mac Jones, on the other hand, we're going to go ahead and we're going to sit him. The Bills allow the least points per game to quarterbacks with 9.4. Mac Jones has not scored over 14 points in a single game since week 1. And he hasn't been above 7 since week 3. He's thrown an interception in 5 out of 6 games this season, and it's honestly only a matter of time before he gets benched for somebody like Bailey Zappi or whoever else is on the quarterback roster for the Patriots. Next up, we have an NFC divisional matchup between the Giants and the Commanders. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Sam Howell, who's quickly becoming one of my favorite fantasy options this year. The Giants allow the 14th most points per game to quarterbacks with 15.89. He's currently the 12th fantasy quarterback, and he has 5 finishes of QB 14 or better in 6 weeks. His only bad week was versus the best defense against quarterbacks in the NFL, the Bills, where he threw 4 interceptions. He's a definite start. As for Daniel Jones, the Commanders do allow the third most points per game to quarterbacks with a little over 20, but he struggled this year. He's been quarterback 26 or worse in 4 out of his 5 games, and he's dealing with a neck injury. Even though he has a good matchup, he needs to show some improvement, and he needs to be sat until he can do so. A lot of divisional matchups this week as we add the NFC South to that list. The Buccaneers and the Falcons are up next, and we're going to sit both of these quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield, the Falcons allow 15.81 points per game to quarterback, but they have allowed the third least passing yards. He's also dealing with a hand contusion that he got on the last drive of the game. He's a mid to low quarterback 2 this week. It's not an awful matchup, but I think that there are better options out there for him. As for Desmond Ridder, the Bucs allow the 12th least points per game to quarterbacks with a little under 15. He's currently quarterback number 17 in fantasy. He's had 2 great back-to-back weeks, but the Bucs are a tough defense, and it should be a lot harder because of how difficult divisional matchups are. Up next, we have the Seahawks versus the Cardinals, and this one's going to be a little controversial because I'm starting Josh Dobbs and I'm sitting Geno Smith. As for Josh Dobbs, the Seahawks allow the 11th most points per game to quarterback with 16.69. He's also rushed for 40 yards in 4 out of his last 5 games, and he's currently the number 18 fantasy quarterback. He has a good matchup versus the Seahawks, and this team should run the ball less because James Conner is hurt, and they didn't really find success running the ball last week. As for Geno Smith, the Cardinals do allow the 5th most points per game to quarterbacks with just a little under 19.7, but he's only the quarterback 23 in fantasy. He has 1 top 15 finish this season, and he's playing poorly against really bad defenses. I can't trust him to be a main starter right now, so I'm going to bench him until he can prove otherwise. Next up, we have the Rams going against the Steelers. I'm going to start Matt Stafford. This one might be a little iffy for me. The Steelers allow 15.53 points per game to quarterbacks. Stafford's currently QB 16 in fantasy, so he's like right there in the middle, and he's only thrown 6 touchdowns compared to 5 interceptions. But he's finished with 3 straight top 16 finishes, and his top 2 running backs are out. It should force the Rams to be more reliant on their passing game, and I feel like Stafford should flourish here. As for Kenny Pickett, the Rams do allow the 12th most points per game to quarterbacks, but the Rams have only given up 4 passing touchdowns. Pickett's also QB 15 or worse in 5 out of 5 weeks, and it seems like he's pretty big play reliant. I look back on the game, I believe it was versus the Browns, where George Pickens scored a really, really long touchdown. I don't see that happening every week, and therefore I can't start Pickett until he's more consistently reliant. The Broncos versus the Packers are up next, and I'm going to go ahead and start both of these guys. Jordan Love is really easy. The Broncos allow the 2nd most points per game to quarterbacks with a little under 21, and they've also allowed the most passing touchdowns in the NFL with 14. They've also allowed the most passing yards in the NFL with over 1,700 through 6 weeks. He's coming off of a bye, and he's looking to bounce back after an 8-point performance, so I'm definitely going to start him. As for Russell Wilson, the Packers allowed the 9th least points per game to quarterback, but Wilson is the number 11 quarterback in fantasy. There's a struggling offensive unit here in Denver, but Wilson is consistently putting up numbers. It's a bad matchup for him, but somehow he still finds ways to be fantasy relevant, especially because his team is usually losing, and for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start Wilson. Next up, we have a really high-powered divisional matchup between the Chiefs and the Chargers. We're going to start both of these guys, obviously. Justin Herbert is a definite start. The Chiefs allow the 8th least points per game to quarterbacks, but it doesn't matter. He's QB 6 in just 5 weeks. He has no finishes worse than QB 12. He's a locked-in start for the rest of the week. As for Patrick Mahomes, who is my start of the week, the Chargers allow the most points per game to quarterbacks with just under 22. He's the number 4 fantasy quarterback. He's facing consistently one of the easiest schedules of the entire year. Through this season, he has no defense worse than 7th most points per game allowed to quarterbacks until week 12. He's locked in as a start each and every week until then, and probably after that. Up next, we have possibly what could be the most exciting game of the week between the Eagles and the Dolphins. We're going to start both of these guys once again. Jalen Hurts, the Dolphins allow the 7th most points per game to quarterbacks. He's currently fantasy quarterback number 2. The Eagles have the 2nd best offense in the NFL behind the Dolphins, and he has top 10 quarterback finishes in 5 consecutive weeks. As for Tua, he's probably considered the MVP favorite as of right now. The Eagles allow the 6th most points per game to quarterbacks, and they've allowed the fourth most passing touchdowns with 11. He's currently the number 3 fantasy quarterback, and the Dolphins have the best offense in the NFL. This should be a really nice matchup with a lot of great fantasy performances. And last but not least, we have our Monday Night Football matchup between the Vikings and the 49ers. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Brock Purdy. The Vikings allow the 9th most points per game to quarterbacks with just under 18. He's currently fantasy quarterback number 10, and he's looking to bounce back after facing the NFL's best defense in the Browns. He has 10 touchdowns to 1 interception this season. He's putting up consistent numbers. He has a good matchup. As for Kirk Cousins, the 49ers allow the 3rd least points per game to quarterbacks with a little under 10. They forced 10 interceptions. That's the most in the NFL. He is the number 8 fantasy quarterback, and he's usually a quarterback 1 in most matchups, but this is a really tough matchup this week, and for that reason, I'm going to struggle to start Captain Kirko versus the 49ers. And that's going to do it for this week's Stardom Situm Quarterback Edition. I hope you guys liked this video. If you guys want to see more videos like it, make sure you subscribe, like my videos, comment if you're new here, if you have any fantasy advice or have any questions. I would love to hear them. And I will catch you guys in the next episode. Peace.